the cognitive linguistics work of Lakoff and Johnson and Eve Sweetser, a whole bunch of people working in that sort of field, it all suggests that most of the stuff that we think about, and certainly most of the stuff we talk about, is not concrete and directly available to the senses. It's abstract. Some figures put that as high as 95%. Something like 95% of what we talk about is abstract. And, by inference, that means that we're also thinking about abstract things most of the time. And certainly most of the interesting stuff. If you want to talk about love, or you want to talk about politics, or you want to talk about the far end of physics, or you want to talk about pretty much anything that's interesting, it's not the concrete stuff, it's the abstract stuff. I think the problem for a while was a consideration of how do we go about doing that? How do we think and talk about abstract entities which aren't available to the senses? And as far as I understand it, older understandings of that, or older interpretations of that, was that the mind was basically a computational engine, a symbol-wielding machine, and we understood complex and deeply abstract ideas simply by rendering into symbols and manipulating the symbols, pretty much the way that a computer would. A computer doesn't need to understand what its calculations mean, it just has to go through the calculations. So there's certainly things like good old-fashioned AI explanations of cognition would stress that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and there's no need for us to consider the difficulties of trying to work out abstractions. More recent understandings, particularly in this area of cognitive linguistics and experiential philosophy, experiential psychology, those sort of areas, suggest that that's not really the case, that cognition is an extension of bodily engagement, really. I'm thinking particularly of Mark Johnson's excellent book, The Mind and the Body, or Body and the Mind, I beg your pardon, and his more recent one, The Meaning of the Body, in which he talks about that very, very close relationship between how we think and how our bodies and our senses are assembled and how they engage with the world out there. So as I say, the problem that still presents is, how do we go about thinking and talking about aspects of the world which are abstract and which don't make an imprint on our senses. Can't see them or touch them. And the usual explanation for that is that it's through metaphor, conceptual metaphor. And again, Lakoff and Johnson developed this idea of the conceptual metaphor in a really elegant way, really, and very convincing, and I think quite robust way that suggests that certainly most of the way we think and talk, particularly when we're talking about interesting things, is metaphorical. And what they also stress is that this use of metaphor isn't just sort of poetic. It's not the poetic dressing on the top of our speech in the way that perhaps people used to think perhaps of metaphor in poetic terms. It's the absolute fundamental ground of our speech and our cognition. Talking at all requires, and thinking at all in any sort of complex way, requires the use of metaphor, up to 90%, as I say. And also, not only is metaphor not just poetic, it's also not just conscious. So most of our non-conscious thinking is also using the structures, the image schema that we inherit and that we borrow, we source from the outside world, metaphorically mapping concrete experiences that we have, concrete sensory experiences that we have, onto abstract experiences which are not available to the senses, not available to direct experience. So what that seems to suggest is that we have these two ways of knowing, these two engagements with the world. There is this the stuff that I'm walking on right now, the stuff that I'm seeing, the stuff that I'm feeling with my fingertips, the direct, concrete experience, which, as I say, makes up something like 10%, let's say, of our speech and thought. And then there's all this other stuff, all this metaphorically engaged stuff, sort of imaginative stuff, if you like, which is, you know, the vast majority of the fabric of my thought and speech is that kind of metaphorical engagement. So there's these two, apparently there are these two types of experiences and cognition types. And one would think, at least I would think, that that difference would map onto other sorts of differences. And the one that immediately springs to mind is the difference between the sacred and the profane. I think we ought to, I wasn't brought up a particularly religious person, but even I have got this sense of some things are sacred and some things are profane. I would have a major problem defacing a Bible, for example, even though I'm an atheist. So I have this understanding that some things are sacred, with an emotional response to those things. And then I have other relationships to things which are profane, which are of this earth, and which is completely concrete. So I would have thought it would make sense to me that those two ways of approaching the world, the sacred way and the profane way, would map onto the concrete and the metaphorical. But in some ways it's a shame, but they just don't. A lot of the things that I think should be sacred, or would logically be sacred, in as much as they are non-available to the senses, are not. They're considered to be profane. So the further reaches of atomic physics, the further reaches of astrophysics, the further reaches of emotional engagement, all of the stuff that a lot of the stuff certainly, that we associate with, that are supposedly abstract and therefore metaphorical, are actually regarded as completely profane. Whereas many of the things that I can put my hands on and touch and taste and smell, such as the Bible, or the wafer of communion wafers, those kind of things, completely material objects, I'm encouraged to regard those as sacred. It would be an interesting sort of world that we lived in if there was, that mapping did coincide, if there was a correspondence, so that we felt that, well, there's two ways of looking at it, I think. So we felt that either all those things which are metaphorical and beyond the range of the senses are sacred, and everything that was concrete was profane. That would be one way of looking at it. Perhaps it would be even more interesting, actually, if it was the other way around. If we regarded all of those things which are beyond the reach of the senses, all the metaphorical aspects and metonymic aspects and imaginary aspects of existence, if we regarded those as sort of profane, and we regarded all of those concrete experiences as all the stuff that we can touch with our hands and see with our eyes, if we regarded that stuff as sacred,